Alright, so this is my 13-inch M2 MacBook Air in this lovely midnight blue color. And seeing as the new 15-inch variants of the M2 Air are out, I figured I would give my take on the 13-inch version in 2023. Phew, saved it. Hey, what's good? Prash here, and today I want to talk about the 13-inch M2 MacBook Air relative to the newer 15-inch M2 MacBook Airs that came out this year, because I still feel like there is a compelling case to be made for the 13-inch variants in 2023. So let's get straight into it. So for those of you who aren't really aware, the MacBook Air lineup is the lighter and more portable version of the MacBook Pro lineup, and design-wise pretty much fall in line with the M1 Pro and the M2 Pro Silicon MacBook Pros. Wow, I've said Pros way too many times. And physically, the only real difference here is that the Air lineup is lighter, thinner, and just come in better colors than the M2 MacBook Pros. Speaking of colors, the M2 Air in midnight blue truly looks fantastic, with the only caveat here being that it's a huge fingerprint magnet. But honestly, don't let that stop you from picking this color. Now, the design itself is really sleek, with it feeling very premium and robust, and there's honestly no questioning the build quality here. As far as performance goes, this thing is buttery smooth. I'm able to more than adequately perform all manner of tasks, from browsing the web, answering emails, or running more demanding apps for video and photo editing, such as Premiere Pro and Photoshop. I will say that I can do all of this with really great day-to-day battery life, as I can get up to 6 to 8 hours of solid work done on this thing on a single charge. Now I will say this though, my only real crazy experience with the 13-inch M2 Air was right at the beginning when I first got this device. I found the performance to actually be quite concerning. I found the laptop to get pretty hot while doing basic editing on Premiere Pro. It honestly started getting really hot and then throttling, which led to performance issues such as lag in Premiere Pro and even Photoshop. And I found at one point that the battery actually drained from 75% in less than half an hour, which was quite crazy at the time. I even considered doing the thermal pad fix that was quite prominent at the time. However, this was actually fixed within a week through software updates, as well as the laptop itself optimizing its performance based on my usage patterns and the settings and configurations I did for power and battery management. And it's honestly been working great ever since. I've actually been able to do really demanding editing without it heating up and starting to throttle, with the battery life also returning back to normal, and even while doing these demanding tasks, my average consumption every hour would be around like 10 to 15%, which is actually really decent. So yeah, I don't really know how this happened, but I ain't complaining because it has been fixed. Now here's where I talk about why the 13-inch M2 MacBook Air is the more compelling choice even in 2023 when compared to the 15-inch variant. Now on Apple's website, there's about a $300 difference between the M2 13-inch MacBook Air and the 15-inch variant, with both base models having 8 gigs of RAM and a 256GB SSD. Now, I will mention that the base model 15-inch variant does have the 10-core GPU, but this is honestly negligible, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later. Now, MacBooks are not cheap. I think we can all agree on that, and I think we can also agree on the fact that it is a long-term purchase and investment. And for that reason alone, I really do not recommend buying a base model MacBook of any kind, because you cannot upgrade them later on, and so you're stuck with those specs down the line. So speccing out a 13-inch base model Air with 16 gigs of RAM and a 512GB SSD comes to around $1,650 USD, while the 15-inch base model is about $1,550 USD. So about a $100 difference for a drastically better spec'd Air, doubling the RAM and the SSD. Now a similarly spec'd 15-inch M2 Air will cost you about $2,000 US. And at that point, you're pretty much in the M1 Pro MacBook Pro territory, and that's a whole other beast in and of itself. And I'll admit it, after reviewing the Pro series, I do prefer the screen because of the high resolution and high refresh rate, as well as the speakers of the Pro lineup MacBooks. These are key features that I feel like the Air lineup misses out on. So for $2,000 USD, I honestly think your money would be better spent picking up an M1 Pro MacBook Pro, as you also get the added features of the Pro lineup. Now I just want to jump back to the most cost-effective configuration of the 13-inch M2 MacBook Air in my opinion, which is the standard 8-core GPU variant with 16 gigs of RAM and the 512GB SSD. Now my MacBook is set up a little differently as I picked out the 10-core GPU model with the 512GB SSD and 24 gigs of RAM. Now you're probably thinking, really, 24 gigs of RAM? Are you really that desperate for attention? And the answer is, well, yeah. Not that that ever really impressed any of the girls I ever talked to, but there is a performance increase between the 16 and 24 gig variants. Now this is especially true when performing multiple CPU intensive tasks, like having Premiere Pro, After Effects, and Photoshop open all at once and kind of jumping in between those different apps. The added RAM also allows you to have a bunch more tabs open on Chrome. I'm talking like 100 plus with no issues whatsoever, so that's a bonus. But in saying all of this, the main reason I went for 24 gigs of RAM with my MacBook was so that I could actually allocate more RAM when running Windows virtually off of my MacBook. So for those of you who aren't familiar with virtual machines, you can actually use software such as Parallels to actually run Windows off of your Mac virtually. And you can even allocate RAM and storage to that Windows OS that you run on top of your Mac. So it's actually pretty cool. But for this to work, you will also need a Windows key, and there are some limitations when it comes to GPU emulation on some software, but that's a whole topic for another time. So yeah, as far as RAM goes, I think 16 gigs for most people is plenty. I do feel like I fall into that very small percentage that does require that extra bump up in RAM, but it is a costly bump up in spec, I will say that. Now, as far as storage goes, I think 512 gigs should be standard across the board on every Mac. I think in this day and age, 256 is cutting it a little close. Overall, I feel like I'd spec'd out my Mac pretty well, but I will say this. The one mistake I did make when speccing out my M2 MacBook Air was going for the 10-core GPU variant over the standard 8. Now, this upgrade was pretty much useless. I mean, the performance gains are marginal at best, and overall are pretty negligible. So yeah, don't be stupid like me and just go for the standard 8-core variant instead. Alright, so my final verdict on the 13-inch M2 MacBook Air is that it honestly is still the one to go for in 2023. I've had mine for over 4 months now and I'm extremely happy with my purchase. It's been an absolute workhorse. Now, the larger 2-inch screen on the 15-inch variant, however you want to measure it, is honestly more of an aesthetic change in my opinion. I mean, to be fair, you do get a bigger battery with that bigger chassis in the 15-inch. However, you also get a bigger screen you have to power. And while I think that the increased real estate in the chassis itself means you can get better thermal management, I honestly haven't had any heating problems other than my first initial usage. So for me, it's not that big of a deal. So when it all comes down to it, having a well-spec'd 13-inch M2 MacBook Air, in my opinion, is much better than a base model 15-inch MacBook Air in 2023. You'll be paying about 500 USD extra for a well-spec'd 15-inch M2 Air, at which point you could possibly even spend a little more and just go for an M1 Pro MacBook Pro, which is an even better laptop when it comes down to it. So yeah, this has been my take on the 13-inch M2 MacBook Air in 2023. But yeah, for now, it looks like we're out of time, so I'll catch you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching.